Today's story is a little bit different from the last few in that it doesn't feature an oni, but it does give us a glimpse of the ideas that the ancient Japanese had surrounding gods, what they are, how they come about, the kinds of interactions they have with even people of low rank, and that there were some very, very dark gods indeed. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale from the Konjaku Monogatari Shu. And if you like Japanese history or Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel because I do put out at least one of these videos every week along with some other things analyzing classical Japanese and games and anime and whatnot. And with all of that out of the way, let's just get right into the actual story. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. In a time that is unknown, most likely because of damage to the original text, there was a coughing plague that spread throughout the entirety of the country. It spared no one, high, middle, lowborn. If you were alive at the time and in the area, you almost certainly ended up bedridden for a time while you dealt with a very, very serious cough. Now luckily, as bad as this cough was, it was still only a cough. And while it put loads of people out of commission for some time, no one lost their life to it. Which is more than can be said for other plagues in Heian period Japan. Outbreaks of deadly disease were, unfortunately, a fairly common occurrence, as it was in most agricultural societies of ancient times. There was one particularly bad epidemic of smallpox that happened a few centuries before, in the middle of the Nara period, that historians believed killed almost a third of Japan's population. And ever since then, smallpox would flare up occasionally in places, though it was never quite as bad as that first wave. Of course, though, smallpox wasn't the only disease that everyone had to deal with at the time. Measles and influenza also would crop up occasionally, take a number of lives, and then subside. Living in such conditions was indeed a tragedy, but the people just made do with what they had and tried to live life to the fullest despite the danger of it being cut short so soon. So, you can imagine, when this cough first started spreading, everyone was very, very worried about it. They were terrified that it was only the start of something much, much worse. But much to everyone's relief, it ended up being only a cough. A pretty bad cough, of course, but just a cough. It was during this coughing outbreak that there was a certain man who worked at the home of a fairly prestigious nobleman in the capital. We don't know anything about who this man was, whom he worked for, or any of the usual details that these stories like to include. But the details aren't missing because of illegible writing in this case, or a damaged text. They're just never mentioned. Who did this? Why did they do this? All of those extra details, we just literally have no idea. But there is at least one thing we know about this man, our main character. He was a chef. He was in charge of making sure that the people of the estate that he worked at, aka his bosses, were fed properly. Now I say properly because while I don't know a lot about Heian cuisine from what I have heard about it, it wasn't that diverse or particularly tasty sounding. However, it did take a lot of effort to make, and the defining feature of nobility all throughout history is that they didn't work. You always got somebody else to do it. And so all of the drudgery of kitchen duty was left to men and women like this low-ranking chef. But one day, this chef was about his business as usual, very likely having his hands particularly full from picking up the slack left by some of his co-workers who were out sick. Again, this cough spread everywhere and put a lot of people out of commission. But our main man here was a dutiful man. And he determined that he was not going to let a silly coughing epidemic keep him from doing the work that was expected of him. He worked all day and even into the night, multiple days, until at last, at around the hour of the boar on the day that we are dealing with, roughly around 10 p.m. according to our time, he finally finished everything. Everyone was fed, all the dishes were washed, whatever sorts of responsibilities that an ancient Heian period chef had to deal with, they were just done, and his time was over. However, instead of immediately heading to bed to rest himself from the day's work, he decided that the thing he wanted most was some fresh air. Perhaps being cooped up in the kitchen all day, even in buildings as open and breezy as a Heian period estate, I guess it's all a bit stifling. And getting outdoors for a bit to feel the wind on his face, breathe in some of the night air, and enjoy the sound of the night bugs singing was what he felt he needed more than just about anything. And so, long after dark had settled over the land and everyone in the house had gone to sleep or had otherwise quieted down, this man stepped outside. He wasn't planning on going anywhere really, or going very far. This is where he lived after all. He just needed a minute to refresh himself and decompress. Things, again, had been very rough the past few days for everybody. So once he exited the building proper, he made his way down the steps and out into the garden, admiring the moon and the stars and the way the night breeze rustled through the trees and the intense, peaceful quiet of it all. It was very, very refreshing. He didn't have anywhere particular to be and just kind of followed wherever his feet took him, and eventually found himself wandering next to the main gate. Now, being the main gate, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some torches or braziers or some kind of light source there. I mean, Heian period aristocrats were sometimes known to call on each other in the wee hours, and so it only made sense to keep some kind of light at the gate to indicate to anyone coming or leaving where exactly they were, and in case anyone did show up, you could then check for anything suspicious, or turn anybody away who wasn't supposed to be there, or not, sophisticated enough to be in your presence. Basically just having lights at the main gate was a really, really good idea. Now, the chances of somebody showing up were slim. So slim, in fact, that there weren't even any guards posted at the gate itself. The chef basically just had the entire outside garden, all of the outside area, to himself. And so, passing by the gate, the man just allowed his gaze to be pulled every which way. To the moon, the trees, whatever happened to catch his eye. But when he brought his gaze back to the gate, he suddenly realized that there was a man standing there, right next to it. The chef, of course, was a little bit surprised and put off and perhaps a little bit scared of this. Having someone suddenly show up in the middle of the night was definitely not a common occurrence and usually not a good sign, unless they were in like a carriage, something to indicate that they had a reason to be here, that it was a high-ranking person who actually had business at the estate. But also, when the chef looked a little closer at this man, because obviously what else was he going to do? This was a brand new person, somebody who came out of nowhere. He had to look. He had to make sure that he wasn't about to get mugged, right? But when he looked a little bit closer, he noticed some very concerning details. This man was wearing a red, formal outer kimono, a sign of someone of the 5th rank, as well as a proper kamuri headdress, and to top it off, his demeanor and bearing suggested that he was definitely some sort of a nobleman. Okay, so at the very least, we know that this isn't some, random ruffian running around going and stealing stuff from people's houses, breaking and entering and doing all sorts of heinous acts, right? This was a nobleman, and this was a man of class. But what the heck was a random nobleman, whom this man had never seen before, doing next to this gate? Clearly, he wasn't someone from this house. And he wasn't some servant sent to pass letters in between nobles in the dead of night. He also didn't have an entourage, or a carriage, or anything else that you would expect somebody of his rank to have. Something was clearly not right. And the chef could feel as the fear and anxiety rose in him with every second that passed, and he looked and stared at this strange nobleman. But not knowing really what else to do, and finding himself in the presence of a very, very fine gentleman, and not being nobility himself, as soon as the chef met the eyes of this mystery man, he instantly took a knee in deference and bowed his head, as of course was proper. For a moment, the stranger said nothing, and the chef could practically feel his gaze boring into the top of his bowed head until, after a few seconds, the stranger spoke. "Do you know who I am?" Now, as soon as the man's voice met the chef's ears, the chef realized that there was something off about this guy's voice. It almost seemed like it had some sort of a power behind it that only increased this chef's sense of dread. But it was such a subtle effect that he couldn't be sure. Maybe he was just tired from working so hard all day and just needed some sleep. Maybe the strangeness of the situation was just making him hear things. But being too scared to really question what was happening, and not wanting to upset this very clearly high-ranking man, the chef simply replied, "No, my lord, I do not know you." Another few intense, silent seconds passed, with the chef remaining on his knee, refusing to look up and wondering What was even going on? Who was this guy? Why was he here? Why was he not saying anything? Why was he just staring at him? But after this brief silence, the stranger spoke again in that eerie-sounding voice. I am the former Dainagon of old. Dainagon means Grand Counselor of State, by the way. Who in life was called Tomono Yoshio. I was banished to Izu province where I died, and soon after became a god of disease and plague. But though I unintentionally committed a crime that saw me burdened with a severe punishment, during my time in service to the Emperor and the realm, I came to owe everything I was to my country and my people. Thus, this year, there was to be a plague the likes of which none under heaven had ever seen before. A plague to destroy almost all life in this land. But I went forth and pleaded for my country to be spared of such a calamity. My prayer was heard, and my will made it such that this most deadly of plagues was turned into a plague of mere coughing. And that is why this sickness besets all mortals in this land. I have come before you now only to declare this to my people. You have no need to fear me. As soon as this mystery man finished with these words, he vanished into thin air, to nowhere, just disappeared before the chef's eyes. Of course, the chef had no idea how to respond to any of this. He just kind of knelt there, mouth agape, trying to process, trying to make sense of what he had just seen and heard. Although this so-called god of plagues had told him not to be afraid, the chef was nothing but afraid. What was this all about? Was that really a god? It had to be at least some kind of ghost or something. But was everything that it had said true? What was a poor servant chef supposed to do with this kind of information? At some point, though, he did manage to gather the courage to gingerly get back up to his feet, go back home, and bunker down for the night. The next day, he then told everybody that would listen everything that had happened the previous night. How he had gone outside for a bit of fresh air, how he had found this stranger, how this stranger had claimed to be Tomono Yoshio, a famous Dainagon from ages past, and how he had claimed that he had become a god of sickness and plagues, and that it was by his grace that this coughing plague was only a coughing plague and had not been something much, much worse. Now, it's also very clear that everybody just kind of believed him. Again, in ancient Japan, they just took these things for granted. This was something that happened. You believed in gods and ghosts and plagues sent by the gods as a matter of course. However, people did question, of all of the people in the country to relay this information to, why would a god of plagues choose some random, low-ranking, low-born chef of all people? Why not go to a high-ranking person who was very well connected? Why not go to the emperor, who presides over this land and its people? But then, the ways of the gods are rather mysterious. Even to the ancient Japanese people, things happened that they just simply could not explain, and the only thing that they could think to say about it was that it was the will of the gods. And thus is it said by the people abroad that this plague god, this former Dainagon, Tomono Yoshio, must have had some reason for telling his story, for explaining his grace and his goodness to a random chef. And that is the end of the story. This one wasn't quite as exciting as some of the previous ones, but it's still a very interesting story, and I think the thing that I like the most about it is it gives us a glimpse into the ideas and the concepts surrounding kami in ancient Japan. This man was formerly a man who lived. He was alive. Tomono Yoshio was an actual person. However, even though he committed some sort of crime, and I don't know exactly what the nature of the crime was, even though he committed some sort of crime and was banished, after he died, he eventually became a god, and yet still felt so indebted to his country that as a god of plagues, as a god of sickness, he wanted to make sure that his country was not just absolutely devastated by a sickness or some kind of disease that we don't know exactly what it is, but it was some kind of massive disease, probably to rival the smallpox epidemic that happened in the Nara period that I mentioned at the beginning of the story. So at least there's some sort of cultural, educational value that you can extract from this story, even though it's not quite as scary as some of the other things. But let's be real here. If you met somebody who had a weird way of speaking. You know, you just met somebody out, you were walking out in the streets at night, and somebody came before you, dressed in the most dapper style that you could think of, bearing some of the most finest, fanciest clothes that you've ever seen, and then they tell you, dead in the eye, that they are a god who spared the world from some sort of terrible disease and then disappeared before your eyes. I mean, that would put me off. That would make me a little nervous and be like, oh, okay, you know what? I don't know exactly what I saw, but it's not something that I'm just going to take lightly. You know, that would concern me. But that is where I'm going to end the story, so if you did find this story enjoyable, please don't forget to give the video a like, and please subscribe to the channel, because I do put out at least one of these videos, one of these kinds of videos every week, among other things. And if you've been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshu koso hanberi kere. And hopefully we will see you next week for a much more interesting story. Now here's the thing I do have to say. Technically the next story is also a kind of non-story, like nothing really happens, and I'm considering just turning it into a really short. But if not that, I'm probably just going to skip over that, so look forward to an extra little short about this story that I'll be covering sometime in the near future. But next week, I am planning on going over one of the best stories in this little section of these collections. One of these stories that very, very accurately and very, very detailed describes an Oni. And one of the most interesting stories because there's a lot of details in it. So look forward to that one. But with all of that being said, again, thank you so much, guys. I'm going to end it here. We'll see you later.